or three things I know about her is summarizing a series of papers I've written alone and together with a friend and comrade, Joseph Halevi, who teaches in Australia, but actually is also a person who has studied in Italy, is very connected to Italy and France. The title, I teach in Bergamo, as you know. The title is actually taken from a movie by Jean-Luc Godard, Trois choses que je sais d'elle. Elle is not a woman, but it is a city in the case of Godard. For me, it's the global crisis. I have always wanted to publish a book with this title, but the book on the crisis I did in Italian, a small book. The publisher didn't want to have this title, so eventually it seems the paper of the Cambridge Journal will have this title. I start with Europe in the global crisis. The European crisis started in the mid-2008, actually, before Lehman Brothers. It is funny because in August 2008, the European Central Bank was still rising the interest rate. The crisis, however, the European crisis, was an episode, and is an episode in a more global crisis, a crisis which has been born in the USA, and a crisis which has been started by the subprime collapse in the mid of 2007. I insist on this because very often you hear commentators speaking of a crisis began in 2008, in September 2008, as if Lehman Brothers was the beginning of the crisis. In my view, actually, the crisis exploded in the mid-2007, but it was already there since 2005 when you had the deflate of the housing bubble in the United States. But in my view, actually, the present crisis had its true beginning in 2000 with the collapse of the so-called dot-com economy, the internet economy in the US. If you look at Europe, you have this strange situation. The external position of Europe, I mean the trade balance and the current account balance towards the rest of the world, is almost balanced. Now it is even slightly positive. If you look at the ratio of the public debt over GDP, well, it is not really a serious problem. It is almost at the same level than US. It is much lower than Japan. If you account in the UK public debt, also the expenditure to sustain bank and finance, the UK will be well over the Europe. So there is no real and external problem for the Eurozone, nor there should be a sovereign crisis in the Eurozone. Many people think that the crisis in Europe is the fault of the euro, of the single currency. I actually was an early critic of the project of the single currency since the early 90s, since the Maastricht Treaty. I think there should have been something very different from the euro, but I do not think that this crisis is the fault of the euro. Though it is true that the faulty institutional design of the European single currency is making things much, much worse. Other authors, sometimes the same authors, say that the European crisis is due to the neo-mercantilist policies of a part of Europe, let us say the center-north of Europe, Germany and its satellites. For satellites, I mean Belgium, Netherlands, Austria, I mean Switzerland, I mean Finland, I mean, even Sweden is out of the euro as Switzerland. This is the area who exports more than it imports, and a lot of these net exports are towards the southern Europe. So this author says it is a problem of core periphery, and this is the reason of the European crisis, and this European crisis. Again, I was one who insisted that the neo-mercantilism is a problem in Europe, but again, I do not think that this crisis, the crisis of the euro and of the eurozone, is strictly speaking immediately due to neo-mercantilism and this break, this fracture between the center northern Europe and the southern Europe. Other people think that this is a sovereign crisis, a public debt crisis, but as I told you before, the data are actually not supporting this, so we have to understand how a sovereign crisis began in Europe. I will treat some of this, most of these topics, and I will try then to ask if there is a way out. When the crisis started in 2007, there were people talking of a Keynes moment, a Marx moment. Other people talked about a Minsky moment. Minsky was an economist that I knew personally, of a very radical Keynesian orientation, and he died in '96. It is important because he thought that capitalism is always tending towards financial crisis, because when accumulation goes on positively, there are bubbles. The positive periods create euphoria. When there is the euphoria, there are bubbles. At a certain point, these financial bubbles, which are due to too much debt, too much private debt, they explode, as it happened in the 30s of the last century. There was an editorialist of the Financial Times, John Oates, who already at the end of July of 2007 said, but this may be a Wile E. Coyote moment actually. That is, the world economy was running, as you know, while E. Coyote does, following, in Italian we call him beep beep, I don't know what is the original name for the bird who is running away, and he runs and runs. At a certain point he runs over the cliff, and he continued running without any problem, as the world economy did during the 2000 and part of the 90s, until while the coyote looks down, and then there are the gravity lessons, as it happened with the subprime crisis. What is the nature of the global crisis? The interpretation of the radical right is that it is the fault of the state, which is predatory. The center-left says, oh, it is just a problem of regulation. There is not enough regulation. Most of the left thinks of the crisis under an underconsumptionist view. The problem is inequality, low wages, which creates a problem of effective demand, which exploded with this Great Recession. Marxists, the true orthodox Marxists, say that this is a crisis due to the falling rate of profit. Others say, well, it is a crisis of too much finance. Sometimes you have the interpretation of financialization linked to the falling rate of profits. Some other times you have it linked to the underconsumption. I'm not a guy of the radical right. I am not of the center left, but I don't think that the underconsumptionist or falling rate of profit or financialization narratives are very, very good. They seem to imply that this so-called neoliberalism has been a feeble economy since the 80s. I don't think so. I think that for a lot of part in the world, the so-called neoliberalism has been a very dynamic economy. This was not true anymore for Japan and Europe after the 90s, but this must be explained. And you can't explain it with underconsumption or falling rate of profit, because actually the rate of profit recovered after the 80s. Low wages were there since the Thatcher Revolution, so you can explain this crisis with phenomena which either do not exist or were there too long ago. Financialization is too generic a term and an analysis. At this point, usually the left starts asking if it is a crisis within capitalism or it is a crisis of capitalism. What we may ask is if we really needed a new economic crisis. When I mean a new economic crisis, I mean a new big, large crisis, because I think that this is a big crisis which is one of those many crises punctuating the history of capitalism. So these crises are not just a conjunctural phenomenon. They are really the end of a type of capitalism. They are not the end of capitalism, but they are the end of specific forms of capitalism. There has been other big crises. There has been the long depression of the late 19th century that I would interpret as a falling rate of profit crisis in the Marxian fashion. There has been the great crash of the 30s, which I would interpret as a realization crisis, a crisis of not enough effective demand following Marx, but also Keynes or Kalecki. There has been the great stagflation crisis of the 70s. Actually, maybe it began a few years before, which has been due also or even mainly to social conflict. There is this Great Recession, which is another big crisis. As I told you, it started in 2007, the period going to the subprime crisis to Lehman Brothers. Then there were the 6 months of real terror in the world economy since Lehman Brothers to March, April 2009. Unfortunately, this great terror didn't last enough because there were the so-called green shoots of recovery, and after that, the capitalist elites and governments thought that they were out of the big problem, so they stopped that kind of Keynesian solutions which they started to use during the period of the Great Terror. I must confess that, however, the state that actually did a true Keynesian economic policy during the Great Recession has not been Europe, even though Germany did Keynesian economic policies at the time. It has not been, even though there was a lot of rhetoric Obama, it has been China. China, during the 6 months of terrors, did a very, very huge public expenditure in deficits with infrastructural investments. Crisis came to Europe in 2010, starting from Greece. In 2011, the domino effects hit Italy, and so we are here with European crisis. If we want to understand, however, which kind of crisis is this, we have to understand which kind of capitalism is in crisis. And this capitalism is the so-called neoliberalism. The neoliberalism beginning with Reagan, you see him in the photo. There is also Volcker, who in the photo was the governor of the Federal Reserve in '79. He made the shift in economic policy from Keynesianism to monetarism. Of course, in those years also Thatcher made the shift in economic policy. What is neoliberalism, however? We all use this term, but I think that we don't understand this term. The Volcker shock 79, 82 was based on monetarism. Monetarism was the idea that the problem is inflation, and you fight inflation reducing money supply. If you reduce money supply, you also hit the trade unions, so you also reduce the wage inflation. This was done for 3 years, and for 3 years they had the wages going down, so the reduction of the consumption of workers. You had very, very high interest rates, not only in nominal terms, but also in real terms. Real terms means nominal minus inflation. So actually the investment went down. You had the beginning of an attempt to reduce the public expenditure, even though more and more the public debt exploded because the interest rate on public debt went up. So, you know, in this world you had not the demand coming from government enough. You had not investment. You had not consumption from workers. As a world, as the planet, you cannot export somewhere else on the moon. So you have no effective demand from net exports. So the real problem is why there was not a big crash for effective demand in 82. And actually we were almost there. There was a tendency to stagnation. The tendency to stagnation was opposed by two very big, great Keynesians. Their names are Ronald Reagan and Alan Greenspan. Ronald Reagan, first they had to stop in 82 because the crisis was hitting Latin America, and Latin America was very hugely indebted with the US banks. So if you let Latin America fail, there is the collapse also of the American banking system, and they didn't want this. Actually, the second Reagan was a kind of weaponized Keynesianism. I take the label from Paul Krugman. So actually, in the second mandate of Reagan, you had the so-called twin deficits. The deficit of the fiscal state, that is, the state spent more than what it gets from taxes, of course, in weapons, etc. But the United States became the importer, the net importer from the rest of the world. This is true of all the Anglo-Saxon capitalism, with the exception of Canada, but it was really, really huge for the US. So the US were starting to resolve the effective demand internally through weaponized Keynesianism, but also for the rest of the world. There were countries like Japan, like East Asia, like part of Europe, who were exporting in Anglo-Saxon capitalism. But then, if you ask who is the president of the United States who made explode the public debt, you have two names. The first is Reagan, and the second is George Bush Jr. Then you had Greenspan. Greenspan became in 87 the governor of the Federal Reserve. He is even more conservative than Reagan. He is more conservative ideologically than Friedman, the monetarist pope, or even Hayek. He was a follower of a woman very radically right and libertarian, Ayn Rand. But when he became the governor of the Federal Reserve, there was a huge crisis in 87, a huge stock exchange crisis, the most serious after 29. And what he did what the Keynesians would have said. He gave a lot of liquidity to the market, and he continued to do so in every crisis. So the stock exchange started to know that, yes, in speculation you can win, you can lose, but if things becomes really, really serious, you have the central bank on your side, avoiding that there is too big a collapse of the prices of stocks. So since the 87, and until actually with exceptions, but the trend was that until 2007, you had what Jan Toporowski, that I think you know because he was here many times, a capital market inflation. That is, an inflation of the prices of financial assets, stocks, but then also houses which became financial assets. So we start to understand the mechanism which was built in Anglo-Saxon capitalism. Thanks to Volcker, but also thanks to Reagan, Thatcher, Greenspan, etc., workers were traumatized in the labor market and in the labor process. The term traumatized workers, by the way, is not mine, is of Reagan, of Greenspan himself. This should create problems on the side of effective demand. But there were these two other phenomena. The households, even the middle classes households and even the poor households were more and more absorbed in a subordinated way to finance the stock exchange through mutual funds, through pension funds, through subprime, to bank indebtedness. So this kind of savers, so to speak, the households, went into a kind of manic phase. They thought that their wealth was going up. It was just virtual wealth. At the same time, thanks to the access to debt, these families, these households could spend without having actually income. So they were in a manic phase. I write manic depressive savers because when there is the big crisis, these households are forced to go out of the debt. So like in the bipolar psychological phenomenon, they have to go out of debt. So at a certain point, that's wrong, it's not indebted Keynesianism, these households can go into indebted consumption. They can consume more because banks gives them credit, and banks gives them credit on the collateral of the stocks going up or the houses going up. So these were the three figures explaining the model. Yes, traumatized workers, but also manic savers, who became indebted consumers. And all this process was politically induced by economic policy, not the usual Keynesian economic policy pushing up the public expenditure. Economic policy of the central bank who fueled irrational exuberance. I mean, Greenspan helped this capital market inflation. So we had an explosion of private debt. This was the idea of Minsky actually, but in the Minsky model, those who goes into debt when the economy is going up, in his original model, they are the firms. Firms becomes more and more indebted. This was not the story of neoliberalism. The story of neoliberalism was a story in the Anglo-Saxon world in which there were the households going more and more into debt. At a certain point, firms were even not indebted but creditors. So you had a wonderful story of capitalism as a dynamic experience in which there was, yes, financialization, but this financialization is what I call real subsumption of labor to finance, the subordinated inclusion of households into the process, workers themselves through their investment funds, pension funds, etc., households, push for restructuring elsewhere, so that they are granted some of returns on their savings because they are scared for the future. So what happens is that this real subsumption of labor to finance ends up pushing for restructuring in working places, and this creates a new situation relative to Marx. Marx thought that in capitalism there is centralization and concentration, meaning the concentration of ownership, but also the concentration of workers in bigger and bigger factories. No, we had the concentration of ownership, centralization, but not anymore the big Fordist factory. Of course, you didn't go back to the small, medium factory. You had a new kind of capitalism based on a network firms. And it was a very dynamic process, but it exploded. It exploded with the crisis of 2000 and of 2007. Here I go very quickly. I said that Minsky had a different idea in his books about this private indebtedness. But actually, after his last book of '86, he started to understand what was going on. You have to understand that these processes were created during the high 80s. So he started to, in his papers, to see what was going on. He called this new capitalism money manager capitalism, because households gives their savings to the money managers. I say that, like Toporowski says, this money manager capitalism creates capital asset inflation. I insist that this is a real subsumption to finance, a subordinate incorporation of families into finance, which press for continuous restructuring. This creates, of course, the fragmentation of labor, the casualization of labor. This process is a process which pushes for the exploitation of workers, more exploitation in production, but this exploitation must be realized on the market. How? Thanks to this consumption, in-depth consumption, which is driven by asset bubbles sustained by a new monetary policy. The first round of the crisis, I told you, was the dot-com crash. The second round was the subprime bubble, which was anticipated by the housing crash in 2005. When the crisis breaks up, there is the phase so-called of debt deflation, also because not only households, but also firms must go out of debt. When they do this, they reduce demand. The same happens with the states when they start austerity policies. They want to go out of their debt. They are reducing the demand they give to the economy. But this is a paradoxical process. Why? Because everybody reduced demand, so there is less production. If there is less production, there is less GDP, less gross domestic product. So you don't go out of debt. You go more into debt. And this is what is happening dramatically in Europe just now. So if you start from 2007 and looks at the papers, you see that from 2007 to 2009, this cry of help of Wile E. Coyote went up and up. But there was this falling down, just a hope in 2009 that the crisis was beginning to be over. But that was not true, and especially was not true for Europe. Europe is still below the level of 2008. Only Germany, I think, recovered. If you look at other countries, including Italy, they are going down. European neo-mercantilism. I told you that in Europe there are countries, Germany and the satellites, which makes profits not from indebted consumption, but from net exports in trade balance reinvested abroad. When I say satellites, it is not insulting. I use this term because I was in Maastricht in '94, a big conference. There was a professor, I think he was Paul de Grauwe, who is a big name in this kind of monetary economics, international monetary economics, and he was in the Netherlands. He used this term. He said Germany and its satellites. Then he realized where he was, because he was in Maastricht. Maastricht is in the Netherlands. So he stopped and said, satellites, it's not an insult, it's a technical term. This story is the story of Germany since the late 40s, but especially since the 60s, to maintain a net surplus relative to the rest of the world. This is going on except for China, but this is maintained also inducing a reduced growth in income and employment, so that wages do not go up and risk a loss of competitiveness. This model, as I told you, is very diffuse. The exports goes to Southern Europe a lot. They went to Russia and Latin America, but in the 2000s it was not possible because Russia was in crisis. Latin America has been hit by the crisis, and so the United States became actually in the 2000s the only buyer, together with India and especially China, for machines, from high quality machine from Germany. And in a sense, part of Italy is a sub-furniture of the good part, say, the advanced part of the Italian productive structure is linked to Germany and the northern Europe. So this world, including Germany, has a permanent deficit towards China, and was linked to the crucial role of the US as a buyer of last resort. This means that this gives you an idea of this division of the world that I told you. This is in 2002, 2007. If you look on the left, you have the euro area economies. You see that half of it are net exporters on your right, and half of it on the left are net importers. And you see Portugal, Greece, Slovakia, Spain, SVN, I think is zero, Slovenia, Italy, and even France. Then you have the net exporters: Austria, Belgium, Germany, Finland. This is relative to the GDP, of course. Netherlands and Luxembourg. On the right, you have a similar division for the world. You have the net exporters outside the euro. You have Norway, I think it is Switzerland, Sweden, Chile, Japan, then should be Denmark, Korea, India. Then you start with the net importers: Mexico, Great Britain, Poland, Turkey, Czechoslovakia, US, Australia, New Zealand, Hungary, and Iceland. You see all the Anglo-Saxon economies except Canada, who is slightly on the right. It is not as the other one. The euro, a faulty institutional design. Yes, of course, the euro was built on the idea that you force a nominal convergence on different economies and they will converge. What happened was the opposite. There was a real divergence in Europe, because everybody sensible knew that if you create a monetary union, you need to have budget transfers from the advanced areas to the others. You need industrial policy so that you push the backward regions to a catch-up of the advanced economies. You need a true central bank financing governments. These are not in the Maastricht Treaty. These are not in the institutional design of the euro. I thought in the 90s, as other economists, that rather than a single currency, it would have been much better to have a common currency. The ideal model is more or less linked to the 1944 Keynes project at Bretton Woods. The idea is to have, in this case not for the world but the European area, a currency for the central banks of Europe, with fixed but adjustable exchange rates within the area. So there is flexibility in this world, and there should be a push for symmetrical adjustment, meaning that the countries which goes into surplus should be induced, otherwise they should be sanctioned, to expand more. If they expand more, they import more from the other European countries, so that the deficits are lesser and lesser for the deficit countries. Of course, there may be structural problems. Then you may have punctual devaluation, and you need to have structural economic policies, but in an expanding economy. This was not done, and we went into the euro. There is something that has to be explained. I don't know if it is in the other slides. What is to be explained is that after the euro was created, it was not an immediate failure. I would have bet on an immediate failure. I would have bet that there would have been a spread like we saw in the last few years already after 1999 or 2002. No, for many years in Europe, the euro seemed a success. And so this has to be explained. One explanation is that actually the markets, the so-called markets, start to think that everybody was as good as German as debtors. So a similar phenomenon to this subprime was going on in Europe. Everybody gave money to the periphery. This meant also that there were capital export, as it should be, from the advanced area, Germany, France, the UK who is out, to Greece, Portugal, etc. And if you go and look, you see what? You see that these countries grew up much more than Germany. Greece, even Portugal, I think, but for sure Greece, etc. The periphery went much better. Ireland and Spain were growing incredibly. They had a kind of Anglo-Saxon model because they had the housing bubble. They had wonderful fiscal situation because they had housing bubble, internal demand, then high GDP. Then they were very good on the Maastricht criteria. Before the crisis, there was a problem. The neo-mercantilist fracture. There were trade imbalances, but nobody complained about that. Certainly not Germany, nor the satellites. Even the fiscal position was not really felt as a problem. Ireland and Spain, as I told you, were a model. But even Italy has been, since a long time ago, a country which had low deficits. The problem of Italy is the debt, the accumulated debt, not the deficits of the 2000. Even during the crisis, we were incredibly virtuous, if you take it as virtue. Yes, this is what I told you before. The fall of the country risk created a kind of subprime effect in Europe, but also the possibility for profits for French banks, German banks, etc. This gives you an idea before the crisis of Germany going more and more in surplus as a net exporter. You see that the euro area is more or less balanced. You see that all the others of the southern Europe are below. Also Ireland is below. Even France is below. Yes, this is a nice thing that has been written on a Greek wall. How crisis came to Europe? Through many channels. I don't go into the detail, otherwise I will not end ever. There were the depressed expectations because Europe as a whole was not growing very much. There was the mortgage and financial crisis in the UK, as it happened in Ireland and Spain, the deflating of the housing bubbles. So UK, Ireland and Spain started to give less demand to the other European countries. Then there was this fact that during the period 2007, mid-2007, mid-2008, people said, oh, don't worry, it is an US crisis. Europe has had the delinking. We are now exporting towards the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China. With my friend Joseph Alevi, we built a caricature in the late 2007 to say this is completely crazy because we have US with a collapse in demand. So the exports of China towards US are going down. So China demands less machines and less high quality consumption goods from Germany. So there is a fall in the exports of Germany. So there is also a fall in the demand of Germany to distribute furniture to the European things. Why I concentrate in this caricature on Germany and Italy? Because between 2007 and mid-2008, Germany and Italy were out of the crisis. They were going relatively well. Remember that even though everybody says that Italy is the sick man of Europe, Italy is the second exporter of manufacturing after Germany in Europe. I will say a few things later. Then there was the problem of Greece, but the crisis is not due to Greece. What matters is the central bank willingness to refinance the public debt, directly or indirectly. This could have happened with Greece, but with every other country. Take a smaller euro, only with Germany and the satellites. If you have an European Central Bank thinking like it does, the crisis could have started in the Netherlands. No, not in the Netherlands. In Belgium. I'm making the error that Jan Dobrowski did in Paris. He wrote Netherlands instead of Belgium. But it's true, Belgium had 100% of the public debt. So if there is not this refinancing, it is not due to the trade imbalances. The trade imbalances are very, very, very serious. If you don't have trade transfers, if you don't have the possibility of industrial policies, etc., you have that the country or the area which has net exports is becoming richer and richer. And those who are net importers are becoming poorer and poorer. This happened for a long time in many monetary unions. Let us say the monetary union dollar in the US. It happened for a while after the war of secession war. It happened in Italy after the monetary union lira after the 60s. So this happened again and again if you don't have policies in that. But it is not a reason for the explosion of the euro. Simply because it is like in the monetary union lira, the fact that, let us do a caricature in reverse. Sicily, big net exporter. Lombardy, big net importer. But Lombardy does services which are sold inside this monetary union lira, and they are very appreciated by the Sicilians. Should somebody care? No. In fact, in Italy, if you ask, as in the US, nobody knows what is the trade balance of Lombardy and of Sicily. In the US, you must be an expert to know what is the trade balance of Massachusetts, Florida, etc. They go into the balances of the central bank, and it is happening in Europe through the so-called target 2 things. I'm not saying that trade imbalances are not a serious problem. They are a big problem for the real economy and for the impoverishing of part of that world. But they are not the reason for the crisis of the euro. Fiscal austerity, as I told you, became the word of the game in Europe, but these policies are self-defeating for the reasons I said. They depress the GDP. One goes more and more into debt deflation. Rating agencies after 2007, as before has been said, oh, they are the guilty ones because they started to downgrade different countries. But in this case, they were absolutely right. What they saw were politicians which were not able to create growth. Certainly they have their fancy and strange idea of how growth is created. But with the policies in Europe, growth was not there, so you had the GDP which was not going up. You had this division of Europe, of the different areas. At a certain point, there was an explosion of the rate of interest in the periphery relative to the core. So what was going to happen is that the people more and more indebted could become insolvent. Because even when you are illiquid, you cannot pay your debt. Yes, in principle, if you survive until the end, you may be solvent. But that's not true, because if the rate of interest goes up and up and the GDP goes down, you are dead. And the markets do this game that if you are dead in 2 years, I take you as dead just now. So what happened was that the crisis in Greece, a tiny segment of the budget of the markets for state bonds, for government bonds, was really, really tiny. You could have condoned all that to the Greek guys. It would have been a problem because, yes, there was the banks connected, but it could have been managed. It was not done. It was done the austerity game against Greece. So Greece went more and more into debt. Then the domino effect went to Ireland, then went to Portugal. Yes, now we are, I think, at 7% of the market for the state bonds. People expected Spain, and after a while, Italy. When the domino effect hit Spain in the mid-2011, immediately hit Italy. Why? Because of what I just said. Italy was, with a growth rate of 0, it was virtuous on the public deficits, but it had a public debt of 120%. You don't need to have a master or a PhD in economics to understand that with the rate of interest of 7%, the stock of the debt becomes crucial. So they start to think, well, these guys in 2 years are dead. And if things goes on in this way, it's better to go away. And what happened in Europe is that because the European Central Bank started to treat the euro of the Greece as different from the euro of Spain, or the euro of Italy, of the euro of Germany, that savers and speculators started to do the same, and they moved their money from the banking and financial system of the periphery to the core and to Germany. So Germany now is going into debt with ridiculous interest rates of less than 2,000% and probably less than the true inflation, while the others are dying. Why? Because the markets for a long while have been betting the explosion of the euro. So at that point, Greece, Spain, Italy will have to pay their debt in a devalued currency. It's better to be in the good part of the present euro than in the part which will have to go out. This game was killed with words more than action by Mario Draghi at the middle of 2012, between July and September. Maybe that Italy now will create again that kind of game. But here is the point, the last one. The fault of the left, in my view, has been to think that the Euro technocrats never change. Actually, until now, I have talked as me too, as if this is true. But if you look from now, if you put yourself in 2007 or even mid-2008, and say, oh, in the future, European technocrats, the European Central Bank, will act as they acted in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, you would not believe that, because they have done a lot of institutional innovation. They have started to give credit to the banks against assets which were more and more worthless, then even against public debt assets. Then they even started to act not only as as a lender of last resort to the banking system, but also to the governments. They did that on the secondary market. And the last move by Mario Draghi is, well, we may think of doing that in certain cases also directly on the primary market. So my bet is that they are really, really willing to maintain the euro. And they do, here I quote Mario Draghi, whatever it takes to do that. So actually, what is my bet on the future is that actually we are in this strange situation, that the euro as it is going towards a kind of blind alley. That the present policies are policies of stagnation. But this does not mean an immediate explosion. This means to maintain the euro on this path. Why? Because I think people like Draghi wants to build, even partially against some German interests, a true European capital with a true European political subject. My understanding of the left is that the left is still reasoning at another level, at the national level. If you stay at the national level, either as capital or as left, you just have to understand that the end of the path is the explosion of the euro. So, if you are on that path, you should work for what is called by somebody a plan B. Let us go out of the euro. Let us go do that now. Possibly, if you are on the left, with some ways to defend the workers' income and so on. I fear that going out of the euro now is not a game. It's not a game because it is not just like the lira who went out of the European monetary system in the 92. By the way, that experience was awful for workers. But this time would be much worse because we are in the middle of a world crisis and against a strong European capitalist project. My perception is that actually if we go out of the euro, what we will have will not be having again monetary autonomy used for social interest. I would bet for more austerity policies, not for less austerity policies. So actually, I think that the way out is not default, the way out is not the exit of the euro. There should be a way out linked through struggles and political actions on a European-wide level for the left. We all know that a way out could be either growth or inflation, but they are not possible now. This is a thing that was created by Occupy Wall Street in New York. You know? The light at the end of the tunnel has been turned off. But the Americans have this other expression. The light at the end of the tunnel may be a high velocity train, a TGV or an Amtrak, going on in your direction. So I fear the light at the end of the tunnel. I don't go on this because I think I spoke almost an hour. I want to say just a few things on Italy. Why Italy is seen as the sick man of Europe? The reasons usually are four. One is the public finance. The second is the income for citizens and the productivity for each worker. The third one is that we have a kind of huge deindustrialization, meaning the almost disappearance of the big industries and the crisis of the industrial districts. The fourth is that we are less and less competitive in Europe if you look at the wage per unit labor cost. These things are true, but I want just to be provocative, saying that yes, the public debt. The public debt, I already told you, so I can be very quick here. We have been virtuous on the deficit. Our problem is the inherited debt stock. But for sure, this crisis, is not due to the deficit. We have done more than enough on that level. And actually, in Italy, as elsewhere, the problem of the public debt is the fault of neoliberalism, not of the preceding era of Keynesianism. If we look at the income for citizens and the productivity for each worker, we see that they are stagnating. Actually, since almost 20 years. This, of course, is linked to the end of the big firms. But we have to say two things here, and also those I anticipated. There is the fact that the Italian manufacturing is the second exporter in Europe. So you have to put these two things together. And this is linked to the issue of the end of the industrial sector in Italy. Yes, the big firms are disappearing. Only Fiat is there, it is not doing very well in the European market. And yes, the traditional industrial districts are in crisis. But Italy has been good in creating the so-called pocket multinationals. They are called by somebody fourth capitalism. They are small and medium enterprises which are able to have net exports and even investments abroad. So what is the problem of Italy here? The problem of Italy here is that you have a very divided Italy in which there are sectors who are stagnating and sectors which are actually very advanced. And the real problem of Italy is that this model of the fourth capitalism, like the model of the industrial district, cannot be a model for an advanced country, for a country as a whole. It can be good for specific areas, but it cannot be the model to extend all over Italy. If you look at areas like China, or even Europe, or even Germany, you see that they have a kind of coherent matrix of firms in every level. Italy now is just betting on few small and medium enterprises, and that's not the way you can have a thriving industry. Yes, we have banking problems, but they are not linked to this crisis. They are linked to liberalization and privatization of the 90s, and they are not linked with this crisis for a very simple reason, because our banking system was relatively backward. That's what they said us during the 2000s. Being backward, we were not in the situation of even French and German banks who went into the crisis with the subprime crisis. We had not so much exposure to the toxic assets. The last point, but I don't want to go into that, is this. I think that Italy is a serious problem of the composition of output, which kind of products we produce, but it is not a backward countries. It has its areas of vitality. But if you want to ask when Italy started to have these problems, actually it has not to do with this crisis. It has not even to do with neoliberalism. The problem in Italy started in the mid-60s. In the mid-60s, the European bourgeoisie did not answer in a progressive wave to the first social struggles of the early 60s. And so they stopped investing for a while. And there was this game which started and never stopped of having sectors and industries disappearing. This is not pathological. In every economy, there are sectors and firms which disappear, and other sectors and firms which come into. This happened. When there was the liberalization, all the big firms were given to the private capitalists who went into the monopolies of the old state firms to get rents. And the only private firm, big firm, Fiat, went into disastrous choices because they were more interested in finance. But this story is a story which goes back to the 60s. So if we want to understand the crisis of Italy, we have to go back. Why I say Italy is a paradigmatic exception? I think it is a paradigmatic exception because the contemporary capitalism is based on this perverse mixture of rent and profit, finance and industry. From this point of view, Italy is the same. It was able, during the so-called Italian miracle, to play this game in an expansive way, but after the 60s, more and more, the Italian economy is showing the rest of the world what is the meaning of having an economy based in which profits are based on rent and finance. I stop here because I think I talked more or less an hour, and it's enough.
Thank you very much for an excellent lecture. I don't think we should have any difficulties continuing the debate. The floor is open. Comments, questions?
If people is interested, I have with my partner Giovanna Verto my Facebook page where we publish our stuff, Italians but also in English. It's called Economisti in Class. It's dual meaning. I hope you get it.
It's good. Yes, please.
I have a question. The recent data shows, for example, that most of the German car producers are selling more cars on the Chinese market and the US market as in the European market. So why the hell they should care about the south of Europe? Is it not better to just left it to crash and make more profits and face less left-oriented politicians and trade unions in the other parts of the world? Is not a Europe falling apart if there will be not a kind of political frame that will bring it together? And is not this the same for Italy? Is not Italy a paradigmatic example of a dual, of a kind of a dual economy, and which might even origins from the times of Risorgimento? I was reading certain studies. You have this anniversary 2 years ago, I believe, and I believe the Italian political science and political sciences, there is still debate what was actually unification of Italy. And is not this phenomenon of Berlusconi a certain truth of Italy itself? Namely that the radio and the television first made Italians as a nation. So I was...
What is Berlusconi here? The role of Berlusconi? I lost it.
Because his nickname is Sua Emittente.
Yes.
Yes, and indeed he was creating his political image based on media. But according to some cultural theorists, Italy become as a nation first with Sanremo and of course I'm exaggerating, but
yes,
of course
I know the
meaning of this debate to be productive.
But you raise actually 3 or 4 points in one question, and all are very, very sensible. About the first, you are quite right. Germany is beginning to sell certain goods more outside Europe than in Europe. In the last few years, a strange thing happened. When the crisis hit Europe, it was late 2008. You know that when the data goes out, they goes out with some delay. And the funny thing is that they are then revised. So what I mean is that sometimes you think you are not in recession, but you are in recession. And you realize that you are more in recession because you go up, go down. So Europe realized to be in crisis more or less at the timing of 2008, September 2008, Lehman Brothers. But indeed, the calculations show that Europe was in crisis well before summer, almost in that period. The crisis hit Germany, and Germans, for a while, even Angela Merkel, looked as a Keynesian. They said, oh, there must be demand. They didn't do like Italy. The Berlusconi government in that period, Berlusconi has always been against this European Central Bank idea, the Stability Pact, but in the last few years of his last government, he was forced to be more serious. And this was done by his Ministry of the Treasury, Tremonti, who decided to cut everything horizontally, to each part of the state should spend no more than 5%. It's not a great idea. And what the Italians did was captured by a phrase of an Italian Neapolitan writer of theater, Edoardo De Filippo, "Ada passà annuttata," which means the night should pass. Let us hope that somehow, somewhere, there will be a new demand. Germany and France didn't do this way. They actually spent, and Germany did even intelligent things like the short week. They didn't let firms fail or workers be expelled. And you see this in their deficits. And there were deficits not because the GDP went down. Also, we had this kind of if GDP goes down, you have to pay more subsidies, you have less taxes. No. In the case of Germany and France, they are a bit different in the policies they did. But in those cases, you had active policies. At a certain point, Angela Merkel and Germany changed their mind. Why? There was this idea that we were out of the big crisis. But if you look at what happened in 2009, 2010, 2011, was the strange thing. Germany started to grow, started to run. For 20 years, they had not very high rate of growth. They started to run. And so they look at themselves and say, oh, we are running, and we are accumulating these huge net exports. And they think that the idea that you are putting forward, which I'm not saying it is wrong prospectively, they thought it was true just now. Now, the fact is that the crisis of the Southern Europe and of the austerity policy in the rest of Europe came back to them. Because if you look at the share of net export of Germany towards the net rest of Europe, is still very huge. They now can't do that. They started realizing other things, that if you are a big creditor, it's your problem. And in Europe, they are big creditors. And what happens if euro explodes? They have the problems on the two sides. They will have huge revaluation, and they don't know actually those credits if they will actually get it. And the banks of Germany are not in a very good shape. And Germany, because they have a lot of credits, and because there are small and medium banks, have a lot of problems. So Germany is against a true banking union with inspectors going into their system. So I am saying that prospectively you may be right, and this, of course, it's a centrifugal, if this term exists in English, a force for the explosion in the future, but not right now. So we are seeing in a minor key a thing that we have seen twice in Europe. My theory is every time Germany is forced into the Euro project, they asked for a price. In my idea, the Maastricht Treaty was a French project, not a German project. They had to sign because of the unification, a lot of other things. But at that point they said, oh, but we want to be sure that those bastard Italians are in chains, so the parameters on the fiscal... This happened again when the project exploded. They resurrected after 1996. We should explain why, but don't go there. So they had to go again into the project because Germany in the 90s was not very strong. They had internal problems. At this point they asked another prize, the Amsterdam and Dublin Pact. What happened? That they were among the ones before the beginning of the European project who were not respecting the Maastricht parameter. They were the one in the early 2000, after the subprime crisis, who broke the Amsterdam and Dublin Pact with the French. So nicely, Mario Monti in a conference said, well, you should look at yourself. Now they start to be a bit more relaxed because the problem is huge. I'm not so sure that at the European level they now will want to implement the fiscal compact as it has been originally designed. So this is more or less about your first thing. About Italy, you are quite right. The dualism is an Italian characteristic, but that has been true, in my view, as I said, of the US, of Germany after the unification. The problem is the policies that are done there. Here I am a bit pro-German. I think that the reason for the strength of Germany is that they did something on a structural level. So I am against the structural policies as they are put forward on the right, but you know, they were able to create goods which are needed elsewhere. They are monopolists in advanced sectors. And that's a great thing. Italy is just a dependent country, you know. As Germany is dependent from China, we are dependent from the rest of the world. This is not a good model, but at least Germany has structural strengths. It's a leader in some point. You are also right about the role of television. That was a positive role. When I was very young, there was a transmission on TV, Non è mai troppo tardi. I don't know if it happens to you. It was a teacher of the elementary school who used new techniques at the time. And he was teaching Italian to old people, to analphabets, etc. The television has been fundamental. It has been a very different kind of television from the Berlusconi one. The Berlusconi role since the 80s has been to capture, after 68 and the 70s, the willingness of the people to be freer and to turn this on an individualistic level. He took the sexual revolution and the sexual liberation, turning into a kind of stupid, sexistic game, you know, and so actually he corrupted the Italian soul.
Any other questions? Comments?
What do you foresee now after the elections?
I knew that there should have been a question like this. It's difficult where to start. I would like to start from a very theoretical thing. Then we go and apply it to Italy. I think I gave a different idea of what neoliberalism is, you know, as a kind of capitalism. But neoliberalism may be seen as a kind of economic policy. In my idea, my thinking is that since the 80s, and especially since the 90s, we have lived through two competing economic policy paradigms. One I call neoliberalism, and the other I call social liberalism. The center-right and the center-left. It is an ideal type, so it's not perfect. But let us say Berlusconi, neoliberalism, Bersani and DPD, social liberalism. Yes, there is the radical left. There are the economists like me. We were out of the game and very, very confused politically. Now, the problem is that the way the left has read neoliberalism and social liberalism is stupid. When we say neoliberalism in Italy, as I fear in most countries, we think, oh, it is the return of laissez-faire. Absolute free market policies. Absolutely not. And I insisted that it was a kind of paradoxical Keynesianism. Why? Now, the neoliberals like Berlusconi or Bush, they are truly for the free market, in the labor market, and on the welfare. I mean, precarization, and land does not give money to people or social assistance to people to do nothing. So they are for the free market there, but they are not for the free market on the goods and service sector, I don't have to give arguments, I just give names. Berlusconi and Bush, two monopolies. They never went into a serious competition policies, and the things like the fiscal pact, the Maastricht Treaty, etc. You go and look at Clinton. He was the one who reduced the deficit in the US. They were Reagan and Bush who exploded it. Berlusconi has been always very vocal against, and even in this election, he was on the opposition from that point of view. So they are not in favor of the economic orthodoxy. Take the social liberals. The social liberals are the opposite. They are much more for the free market than the neoliberals. The social liberals, like Bersani, are for the market has more competition. It is the culture of the antitrust. He became famous because of the so-called lenzuolate, the liberalization of the services, etc. They should push the vitality of Italians up, reduce the rents, the position rent, etc. The theory is very clear. The capitalist wants monopolies. A true free market regulates those bad guys of the capitalists. I have friends who were once very much on the left. Now they ended as editorialists of the Great Recession, who supported very much the pension fund reform in Italy, because this way we are able to create a true stock market in Italy, which is controlled by pension funds, which may be linked to the trade unions. In this way, we can create a contendability of firms, which is what the capitalist big firms don't want. This is social liberalism at its best. They are for the free market, more for the economic orthodoxy, about Maastricht Treaty, fiscal compact, with arguments which are not always stupid. They say, but look what in Italy these Christian Democrats and the socialists did, thanks to the perverse public expenditure. But they are not completely for the free market. In Italy, when you say social liberal, the left thinks, oh yes, they are neoliberal, but just a bit less. No, no. They are people with a good heart. They don't want precarization. They want flexibility of workers. They don't want to destroy the welfare state. They want a different welfare state, and this different welfare state is based, for example, it's not anymore based on work, but it's based on, it's a universal welfare state, which gives to citizens some subsidies, for example, so that we do not defend the work position, but we defend the workers. So that's not anymore. If you are laid off, we give you also some instructions, so you are flexible enough, and you will find a new job. This is not the bad thing. Now, what happened in Italy, as elsewhere, there was a new political cycle. In this way, so the neoliberals go to the government. At this point, they create a general position of trade unions, social movements, the radical left with the moderate left, with the sensible Democrats, etc. They go down, and the social liberals win. The first Prodi. At this point, they look at the finances. There is no money there. We can do anything. So please wait. We will give you the redistribution, but later on. Now let us start with the liberalization, etc. There is a division of the bloc. Even the radical left has to fight the source itself, fight the social movements, who are a bit angry, etc. So this situation ends. And you have a new cycle. And you have the second Berlusconi, you have the new Prodi. My idea is that this cycle was ending because people was fed up of this kind of things. This thing in Italy has been created by a coup d'etat of the European Central Bank and of our President of the Republic. Very well intentioned. Do I love Berlusconi? No, but the way Berlusconi was put out of government in the last year has not been very, 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 very nice. Like in Greece, they said, no, no, you Greek, no referendum, no election now, and they decided the prime minister. The same was done in Italy. Almost the same. I am convinced that if the Democratic Party would have gone immediately to the election last year, Berlusconi would have been destroyed. They didn't want it. I didn't bet, however, on a resurrection of Berlusconi of this kind. I think that he has, however, problem to be a leader now, but for sure, I underestimated his capacity to recover. I thought Monti could have something more, but you see, what happened was, and I was thinking that actually what would have happened would have been a revival of the social liberal thing for a couple of years, probably. What happened is really people was fed up, and they voted for Grillo. The radical left committed suicide. I was in the assemblies at the beginning of the creation of this list, Rivoluzione Civile. I decided personally not to vote them because they were really suicidal and insulting towards people. They put from above lists full of political people presenting the thing as something else. So, you know, they took the 2%. But what happened about people like Grillo is that he was able to collect the criticism also and very much on the left with more precise programs than the far left. You know, the far left only said we are against the fiscal compact. Also Grillo is against the fiscal compact. Then, for that kind of thing, I go with Grillo, not with the other thing. And Grillo was more precise against the euro, etc. The problem is that he is not precise very much. He's more precise, but when you go and look, he has some very, very worrying expressions against the trade unions. We are not right, not left. He expresses solidarity with the neo-Nazis, etc. But he says, okay, let us have a citizen income, reddito di cittadinanza. Where do we take the money? From those bastards of the public sector. So you see, it's something moving. I think that has been that the people of my kind who said, oh, they are just a new Northern League, they didn't enter the game. We should have gone into that game, taken them seriously, discussed one proposition after the other, having a decent program. Otherwise, why people should vote you? You know? What will happen now? It's it's the real issue, and frankly, I don't know. What I read is that Bersani does not want to go into a government with Berlusconi because he would be trapped. So he proposed not an alliance, but a minority government agreeing with Grillo certain topics for a while, on the costs of politics, on the defense of the social situations which are most deteriorated, etc. course, he would have the same problem with Grillo. He is in the hands of Grillo. At the same time, in this way, Grillo does not go into the government, because Grillo will not go into a government to reduce itself to nothing. Today, it seems that Grillo, at first, has said not yes, but almost. The last news of this morning is that he said, no, I will never make an alliance. You know, either they go soon to the election, but I think that this will be actually impeded by Europe. I don't think, and I'm not sure that Grillo will. I don't know. Will win. But if he wins, we will be in a complete chaotic situation, because a lot of good ideas, absolutely no true democracy, no true debate. So it's a complete chaos. Frankly, I fear a turn into more subtle authoritarian dimension, either from above. I don't want to think of something really authoritarian, but you know, I think that Europe may really force much on Italy just now, and so we are in what is called a deadlock. I don't know where we'll go. I have no answer.
Okay. Are there any urgent questions? Otherwise, I think we can conclude at this point. Of course, next week we are continuing with the usual time. It's 6 o'clock on Thursday, as you all know, and I'm also obliged to invite you to buy some books in the backwards. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ricardo, and we'll see you next week.